Saigon, Republic of Vietnam, January 1973. The war is ending on paper. Official records show approximately 35,000 civilian prisoners in South Vietnamese custody, many classified as communists or security offenders. Amnesty International disputes these figures, estimating between 100,000 and 200,000 political and security detainees when emergency decrees and administrative detention are included. American advisors can point to MACV directives citing Geneva conventions, requiring humane treatment, prescribing clear categories: prisoner of war, civil defendant, returnee, innocent civilian. Every captured person, in theory, moves through a regulated chain of custody. The rules existed. The camps were inspected. The paperwork was filed. Yet between the moment of capture and the first official record, something fundamental changed. This is the story of that gap. The first hour after capture, where law met fear and where a prisoner's fate was often decided before any form was ever signed. The fluorescent lights in Saigon's interior ministry burned late into the night of June 1955. On desks throughout the building lay reports summarizing the early results of President Ngo Dinh Diem's Denounce the Communists campaign. The numbers were presented matter-of-factly: arrests by province, trials conducted, sentences rendered. Some sentences were death. The campaign was publicly framed as a limited security operation targeting communist regroupists, cadres who had remained in the South after the 1954 Geneva Accords divided Vietnam. The expectation in Washington and Saigon was straightforward: identify a defined underground network, arrest its members, restore order. The reality unfolded differently. Emergency decrees expanded rapidly. Law 1059, enacted in May 1959, created special military tribunals with broad jurisdiction over acts of sabotage and crimes against state security. The definition of communist activity stretched to include possession of propaganda, failure to report suspicious persons, and association with known subversives. Contemporary estimates, later corroborated by scholars, suggest that tens of thousands were detained or executed under these anti-communist measures during Diem's rule. The American advisors documenting the campaign in cables and reports noted the scale. One embassy assessment observed that the security apparatus was casting a wide net far beyond confirmed guerrillas. What emerged from 1955 through 1959 was not merely a purge of armed insurgents, but the construction of a legal framework that treated communist as synonymous with political criminal. This was foundational. It established a security culture where suspicion justified detention, where emergency powers superseded ordinary legal protections, and where the state's apparatus for handling prisoners prioritized intelligence extraction and political control over due process. The apparatus was built before American ground forces arrived. The precedents were set. By 1959, South Vietnam had emergency laws, special courts, and expanding detention facilities. What it did not yet have was a robust, standardized system for handling captured guerrillas as prisoners of war under international law. That gap would widen in the years ahead. An intelligence summary sat on a MACV desk in 1965, breaking down enemy forces into categories. Main force units, regimented infantry, organized into battalions and regiments, supplied and directed by North Vietnamese Command. Local force, guerrilla units attached to districts and villages, part-time fighters who farmed by day and fought by night. Viet Cong infrastructure, abbreviated VCI, the clandestine political apparatus, party secretaries, tax collectors, couriers, propagandists, recruiters. The categorization looked clean on paper. American and South Vietnamese planners expected that these distinctions would enable efficient handling. Military prisoners interrogated about troop movements, political cadre questioned about party networks, Low-level supporters offered amnesty programs. Field reality proved messier. A farmer in black pajamas captured during a sweep might be main force infantry resting between operations, a local force guerrilla returning from a nighttime ambush, a VCI tax collector, or simply a farmer caught in the wrong place. His classification depended less on objective evidence than on who captured him, where, and what they found in his pockets or his home. Captured code books, tax ledgers, propaganda leaflets, hand-drawn maps, these items determined intelligence value. So did willingness to talk. Training documents recovered from captured VCI showed that cadre were instructed to provide only white information under initial questioning, low-value facts that revealed nothing operational. The first hour after capture became a contest. Could interrogators break through that initial resistance quickly enough to gain actionable intelligence before the prisoner was moved into formal channel? By 1972, South Vietnamese and American records acknowledged 37,451 communist prisoners of war in recognized camps. But this figure represented only those classified as military combatants and processed through official POW channels. Political detainees, security offenders held under administrative detention, and those killed or disappeared before reaching any camp were not included in POW statistics. The same individual, depending on where and how capture occurred, could be registered as a POW, a criminal defendant, a security detainee, or not registered at all. The question of who was a VC prisoner had no single answer. The answer was determined in the first hour. MACV Directive 20-5, circulated to field commands in 1966 and later updated as Directive 381-46, outlined the official procedures for handling detainees. The rules were clear. Capturing units had an immediate duty to protect prisoners from harm. Detainees were to be quickly transferred from frontline units, often South Vietnamese regional forces and popular forces, or ARVN battalions, to district or province screening centers. At these centers, trained personnel would classify each detainee, prisoner of war, civil defendant, siêu hoi retourné, or innocent civilian. Recognized POWs would then move to camps such as Bien Hoa or Can Tho, where MACV provided oversight, and the International Committee of the Red Cross gained periodic access. The legal framework supporting these procedures was comprehensive. Colonel George S. Prue, in his later work, Law at War, Vietnam 1964 to 1973, codified the standards. Torture and unlawful killing were both illegal under military law and counterproductive to military objectives. An enemy who expected humane treatment upon surrender was more likely to surrender. An enemy who expected death or torture would fight to the last round. This was not merely a moral principle, but a tactical one, grounded in lessons from previous American conflicts. On paper, the system looked functional. Registration forms tracked prisoner movement. Camp inspections verified conditions. Legal officers reviewed procedures. The architecture of compliance was elaborate. The structural gap lay at the beginning. Most decisive interactions occurred before any paperwork existed. On a jungle trail, in a village swept at dawn, in a small outpost manned by regional force militiamen who had just lost comrades to a VC ambush. Oversight was strongest in recognized POW camps, where ICRC delegations visited and reports were filed. Oversight was weakest at the point of capture, where fear, anger, and intelligence pressure converged in the minutes and hours before formal custody began. Directives and legal manuals covered everything from registration procedures to camp sanitation standards. They said almost nothing specific about how to manage the first hour after capture, when control was most tenuous and stakes were highest. The American buildup that began in 1965 brought not only combat troops but also an intensified pacification campaign. Multi-battalion sweeps through contested areas became routine. A U.S. advisory team in Quang Ngai province received a field report in late 1966. A 3-day operation had netted 72 detainees. The local district holding facility had space for 20. The province interrogation center was already operating above capacity. Similar reports came from the Central Highlands, the Mekong Delta, coastal provinces along two corps. The expectation in Saigon and Washington was that better security would translate into better intelligence and improved screening of suspects. The Xiao Hoi Open Arms Program, launched in 1963 and expanded after 1965, offered defectors amnesty, rehabilitation, and reintegration. It was publicly presented as a humane alternative to mass imprisonment. By 1972, Xiao Hoi claimed over 200,000 ralliers. Detainee flows during large operations exposed system limitations. Screening required interpreters, trained interrogators, secure facilities, and administrative capacity. These resources often lagged behind operational tempo. Prisoners were held in temporary structures, vacant schools, commandeered buildings, regional force outposts. Processing backlogs stretched from days to weeks. Internal RAND Corporation assessments and MACV reports noted classification difficulties. Some provinces reported more detainees than captured weapons, raising questions about the criteria for arrest during sweeps. Pacification evaluations documented a paradox. Large operations increased both intelligence yield and local resentment. Families whose sons or fathers were detained filed complaints. Village chiefs faced pressure from both sides. Government authorities demanding cooperation, VC infrastructure demanding silence. The system designed to separate combatants from civilians often swept broadly, straining both resources and legitimacy. With screening capacity overloaded, more responsibility fell to the units making initial contact. The first hour after capture, before arrival at any screening center, became more consequential. Decisions made in that hour, under stress and without oversight, shaped whether a detainee entered the formal system as a POW, a Xiao Hoi rallier, a criminal suspect, or not at all. By 1967, MACV statisticians could track POW camps, Xiao Hoi centers, and provincial prisons. What they could not easily track was the gap between capture and registration, the hours and sometimes days when detainees existed in a bureaucratic limbo. A regional force outpost in the Mekong Delta, 2 hours before dawn, December 1967. Mortar rounds impacted inside the perimeter. Small arms fire erupted from the tree line. The attack lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, 3 RF soldiers were dead, 5 wounded. The local district chief had been assassinated in his home the previous week. Now this. At first light, the surviving RF troops and their ARVN advisors swept the surrounding hamlets. They brought 14 suspects to the district compound. Men of military age found in homes near the attack route, some with mud on their feet, others simply unable to account for their movements during the night. Standard procedure called for transferring detainees to the province screening center for interrogation. Reality intervened. Regional and popular forces, RFPF, derisively called rough puffs by American advisors, were local militia, poorly paid, inadequately trained, and acutely exposed to Viet Cong, terror tactics. They lived in the villages they defended. Their families were known. When VC infrastructure ordered an assassination or attack, RFPF bore the casualties. The institutional pressure to produce intelligence, names, locations of caches, identities of cadre, was intense. The emotional pressure after losing comrades was equally intense. Reports from NGOs, testimony from U.S. advisors, and later scholarly documentation describe a pattern. In the first hour after capture in such circumstances, beatings and threats were common. The objective was immediate tactical intelligence. Where is the weapons cache? Who led the attack? Which families are sheltering VC? Some interrogations occurred in front of assembled villagers, performative displays meant to demonstrate government power and exact a cost for suspected collaboration. In a smaller number of documented cases, summary executions followed, bodies left as warnings. These actions rarely appeared in POW statistics. Victims who died before formal registration were often recorded as killed in action or not recorded at all. Those who survived the first hours and provided information might be released, sent to a Chiu Hoi center, or forwarded to province custody, classifications that depended on immediate decisions made by under-resourced, under-supervised local forces operating in a climate of mutual terror. A U.S. advisory report from 1968, later declassified, noted with bureaucratic understatement the problem of rough handling at district level and recommended closer supervision of initial detention procedures. Implementation lagged. The first hour remained the least regulated phase of the capture process. Urban arrest patterns followed different procedures but produced similar gaps between law and practice. In Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, and other major cities, the National Police and its special branch handled suspected Viet Cong, infrastructure, and political subversives. The legal framework was ostensibly criminal procedure: arrests under security laws, interrogations leading to trials, detention in recognized prisons. Urban suspects were not classified as POWs, but as civil defendants or security offenders. Amnesty International's 1973 report, Political Prisoners in South Vietnam, documented systematic torture in national police and special branch facilities. Methods included electric shocks applied via field telephones, beatings with clubs and fists, prolonged stress positions, water torture, and threats against family members. The purpose was extracting confessions and identifying further suspects, names of cell members, locations of safe houses, structures of clandestine networks. Interrogators operated under pressure to show results. Security offenses carried severe penalties, including death, making confessions under duress effectively irreversible. Many urban detainees were held under administrative detention provisions that bypassed normal judicial process. Presidential decrees and emergency laws allowed indefinite detention without trial for individuals deemed threats to state security. This administrative category existed parallel to, but separate from, both the POW system and the ordinary criminal justice system. U.S. advisory reporting on prison conditions acknowledged problems. A 1970 assessment by American legal advisors noted overcrowding, inadequate medical care, and credible allegations of mistreatment during interrogation. Recommendations for reform focused on improving conditions in recognized facilities, those subject to inspection. The initial hours after arrest in police stations and special branch offices remained largely opaque to external oversight. The classification of urban detainees as criminals or political prisoners often occurred after coercive interrogation, not before. A student arrested for distributing pamphlets, a labor organizer detained for strikes, a suspected VCI courier caught near a dead drop location. Each faced interrogation designed to produce both confession and further intelligence. The legal label affixed to their case file reflected the results of those first hours: criminal defendant, security offender, or, in some cases, no record at all if they died during interrogation or were released without charge after providing information. Amnesty's report estimated that thousands of political and security prisoners were held in conditions that violated international human rights standards. Saigon's response emphasized improvements in recognized prisons and disputed the definition of political prisoner, arguing that detainees were held for criminal acts, not political beliefs. The debate over categories and numbers would continue through the Paris negotiations. The Phoenix program, Phung Hoang in Vietnamese, represented the most systematic American effort to target Viet Cong infrastructure. Officially launched in 1968 under CORDS, Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, Phoenix aimed to coordinate intelligence from South Vietnamese National Police, military intelligence, CIA, and U.S. military sources to identify, capture, and neutralize VCI members. Neutralization meant killed, captured, or induced to defect. The numbers were meticulously tracked. By the program's conclusion in 1972, official statistics recorded 81,740 VCI neutralized, 26,369 killed, with the remainder captured or rallied through Siu Hoi. Provincial reconnaissance units, PRUs, often composed of former VC, ARVN troops, and U.S. Navy SEAL advisors, conducted targeted raids. Provincial interrogation centers handled detained suspects. Congressional hearings in 1971, particularly testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, exposed operational realities. William Colby, who directed Phoenix under CORDS, defended the program as intelligence-driven and selective, targeting genuine VCI rather than conducting indiscriminate sweeps. Critics, including former intelligence officers and human rights investigators, described a system under pressure to meet monthly neutralization quotas where torture in provincial interrogation centers was routine, and where verification of whether targets were actually VCI was often inadequate. Internal evaluations echoed some criticisms. A 1970 MACV assessment acknowledged that neutralization figures were misleading and warned that some individuals counted as VCI were likely misidentified. The pressure to produce results, quantifiable monthly statistics for reporting to Saigon and Washington, created incentives for aggressive tactics. The first hour after capture in Phoenix-related operations was shaped by this statistical imperative. PRU raids aimed to capture suspects alive for interrogation, which meant tactical intelligence, names of other cadre, locations of cells, upcoming operations, had to be extracted quickly. Provincial interrogation centers employed interrogators trained in both rapport-building and coercive techniques. Suspects who cooperated early and provided valuable information might be processed as Siu Hoi ralliers, offered reduced sentences, or even recruited as informers. Those who resisted faced prolonged interrogation, including torture documented in multiple reports and testimonies. Phoenix represented counterinsurgency's data-driven evolution, centralized intelligence files, computerized target lists, coordinated operations across agencies. Yet the program's operational core still depended on the first hour after capture, when information was extracted and categories assigned. The modern bureaucracy of neutralization statistics rested on that foundational, often coercive, moment. A combined operation in Binh Dinh Province, March 1970. ARVN troops and RFPF units established a cordon around a hamlet at dawn. Villagers were assembled in the central area, while soldiers searched homes for weapons, rice caches, and suspects. 3 military-age men were detained. The interrogation occurred in public, with the population watching. Counterinsurgency doctrine emphasized winning hearts and minds. Economic development, political reform, protection of civilians from VC terror. The phrase appeared in countless briefings and strategy documents. Implementation in contested villages was harsher. Both sides employed demonstrative violence to shape behavior and allegiance. For Viet Cong forces, this meant assassinations of government officials, attacks on outposts, taxation enforced through threats, and punishment of families perceived as collaborating with Saigon. For government and allied forces, it meant visible displays of power and consequences, detainees beaten or forced to identify other suspects, threats of collective punishment if attacks continued, and, in documented cases, executions conducted where villagers would see. Human rights reports and some internal U.S. documentation acknowledged innocent victims of faulty intelligence. A 1971 pacification assessment noted that aggressive sweep operations in areas with minimal VC presence could generate resentment and new recruitment for the insurgency. The problem was identifying genuine VC among populations where allegiance was coerced, shifting, or entirely pragmatic. First-hour violence in these contexts served dual purposes: intelligence extraction and political messaging. A suspect forced to point out homes of alleged collaborators demonstrated that silence carried risks. Public beatings communicated that support for the VC would not go unnoticed. The goal was less legal justice than behavioral control, making cooperation with government forces appear safer than cooperation with the VC. The pattern created a feedback loop. VC infrastructure punished villagers suspected of informing on cadre. Government forces punished villagers suspected of sheltering guerrillas. Civilians caught between faced pressure from both sides, with the first hour after capture by either force potentially determining survival. One documented case from Quang Ngai, 1969. A village subjected to interrogation and detention after a VC ambush on a passing convoy. 6 months later, the same village faced VC reprisals after RFPF recruited local militiamen. The double pressure left villagers distrustful of all authority and wary of any action that might draw attention. Coercion as a tool of population control proved effective in the short term, destabilizing in the long term. The Tet Offensive began January 30th, 1968, with coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, provincial capitals, district towns, military bases. The initial assaults produced tactical surprise, heavy fighting, and sudden surges of prisoners and suspects. In the first week, MACV headquarters processed operational summaries listing hundreds of attacks, thousands of casualties, and rapidly growing detainee counts. POW camps, such as Bien Hoa, designed for steady inflows, confronted capacity limits within days. Temporary holding facilities were established. Screening centers, already operating above planned capacity before Tet, became overwhelmed. The offensive revealed the depth and resilience of VC infrastructure networks that Saigon and Washington had believed were degraded. It also revealed how quickly the detention system could overload when operational tempo spiked. In the weeks following Tet, South Vietnamese authorities initiated broad urban sweeps, detaining thousands of suspects. Classification and processing lagged. Emergency youth rehabilitation programs were established for captured VC of military age, reflecting concern about the demographic profile of prisoners. Many were young men, some barely teenagers, mobilized by both sides in a war approaching its second decade. MACV and Joint General Staff reports documented the post-Tet detainee surge with bureaucratic precision. Prisoner counts by province, camp capacity utilization, screening backlog durations. The numbers revealed system strain. In some urban centers, the detainee population more than doubled within a month, while the number of trained interrogators and screeners increased marginally, if at all. The structural consequence was predictable. When formal channels were overloaded, more discretion fell to the units and agencies making initial contact. The first hour and first day after capture became even more determinative, as decisions about immediate release, Chiu Hoi processing, formal POW custody, or police detention were made under time pressure and without adequate oversight. Tet demonstrated that despite years of pacification, Phoenix operations, and large-scale military sweeps, the enemy retained the capability to mobilize tens of thousands of fighters and supporters. It also demonstrated that the system for handling captured insurgents and suspects, however well designed on paper, remained vulnerable to overload. The rules existed. The forms were printed. The camps were built, but the critical weak point, the moment after capture, before formal custody, remained largely unregulated and under-resourced. By March 1968, the worst fighting had subsided, but detainee numbers remained high for months, straining resources and highlighting persistent gaps. International scrutiny of prisoner treatment in South Vietnam increased throughout the war. The International Committee of the Red Cross maintained a permanent delegation in Saigon and conducted regular visits to recognized POW camps such as Bien Hoa, Pleiku, and Can Tho. ICRC reports, while confidential between the organization and detaining authorities, generally acknowledged improvements in camp conditions over time. Better sanitation, medical care, recreational facilities, and adherence to Geneva Convention standards for registered prisoners of war. The limitation was scope. ICRC's mandate focused on POWs, individuals formally recognized as combatants and processed through military custody. The larger population of political prisoners, security detainees held under administrative provisions, and suspects detained by national police fell outside regular ICRC inspection protocols. These detainees, numbering in the tens of thousands by most estimates, experienced conditions and treatment that varied widely and remained largely opaque to international observers. Amnesty. International and other human rights organizations attempted to fill this gap. Their 1973 report on South Vietnam documented systematic torture, prolonged detention without trial, and harsh conditions in facilities not subject to ICRC oversight. Religious groups, particularly Buddhist organizations and Catholic relief agencies, brought individual cases to international attention. Journalists reported on prison conditions and alleged abuses, though access was limited and often controlled. The response from Saigon and Washington emphasized compliance with international law in recognized facilities. Official statements highlighted ICRC access, improvements in camp conditions, and legal frameworks governing POW treatment. The narrative was one of progressive reform and adherence to standards. When pressed on political prisoners and police detention practices, authorities argued that individuals were held for criminal acts under South Vietnamese law, not for political beliefs, and that internal legal processes provided adequate protections. The fundamental disconnect involved visibility and definition. Recognized POW camps, subject to inspection and formal reporting, showed measurable improvements and generally met basic Geneva Convention standards by the early 1970s. Provincial prisons, police detention centers, and the immediate post-capture period remained far less transparent. External observers and rights organizations documented credible evidence of abuse in these settings, while official statistics either omitted them or presented sharply lower figures. The debate over prisoner treatment ultimately hinged on what was counted and how it was categorized. Those captured and quickly processed as POWs entered a relatively well-regulated system. Those detained as security offenders, political suspects, or never formally registered, existed in a parallel system with fewer protections and less oversight. A system where the first hour after capture often determined everything that followed. Paris. Winter 1972 into early 1973. Delegation briefing rooms in grand hotels, secure communication lines to Saigon and Washington, classified cables outlining negotiating positions. Among the many contested issues in the Paris Peace Accords, prisoner release and accounting proved particularly difficult. All sides maintained prisoner populations. All sides faced domestic and international pressure for comprehensive resolution. The Saigon government's official position emphasized distinctions. POWs held under military custody numbered 37,451 by late 1972. Common criminals and security offenders detained under South Vietnamese law were a separate category, not covered by POW exchange provisions. The North Vietnamese and Provisional Revolutionary Government delegations demanded broader releases, arguing that tens of thousands held by Saigon were political prisoners detained for their opposition to the government, not criminals under any legitimate legal framework. Foreign observers, human rights organizations, and religious groups supported broader definitions. Amnesty International and church representatives submitted evidence of political imprisonment, arguing that many classified as criminals or security offenders were functionally prisoners of war or political detainees whose offenses consisted of non-violent political activity or suspected sympathy with the revolution. Their estimates ranged from 100,000 to 200,000, when all categories of political and security detention were included. The final accord language on prisoner release was carefully ambiguous. Article 8 provided for release of military and civilian personnel captured in connection with the conflict, but implementation depended on how each party defined these categories. POW exchanges proceeded relatively smoothly in early 1973. American prisoners released from North Vietnamese custody. Communist prisoners released from South Vietnamese camps. Formal ceremonies at locations like Loc Ninh and Bien Hoa provided documentary evidence of compliance. The larger population of political and security detainees remained disputed. Saigon proceeded with selective releases, some amnesties, some transfers to lighter custody, but maintained that many were criminals whose detention was a matter of domestic law, not subject to international agreement. The PRG in Hanoi continued to demand full accounting and release. The prisoner question at Paris revealed how early classification decisions made in district compounds, police stations, and provincial interrogation centers shaped outcomes years later. Whether someone captured in 1968 or 1970 was processed as a POW, a criminal defendant, or an administrative detainee determined their eligibility for the 1973 exchange. Those decisions, often made in the first hour after capture under stress and without oversight, now became matters of international negotiation and legal interpretation. Film footage from March 1973 shows prisoner exchanges at designated locations. Communist prisoners, dressed in clean civilian clothes, board trucks and aircraft for release to PRG or North Vietnamese control. The ceremonies are formal, documented by journalists and official observers. American prisoners released from North Vietnamese custody receive extensive media coverage. The public narrative emphasizes resolution, POWs returning home, the war's prisoner question answered. Behind the ceremonies, a more complex reality persisted. Exchanges focused on individuals formally recognized as POWs under military custody, the 37,451 tracked in official statistics. Political prisoners and security detainees held under South Vietnamese law, numbering far higher by NGO estimates, remained largely unaffected by the exchange provisions. Some received amnesties or reduced sentences as gestures toward the peace process. Many stayed in custody. As South Vietnam's military position deteriorated through 1974 and early 1975, prison policy became chaotic. Some facilities released prisoners as defensive, positions collapsed, and government authority evaporated. Other prisons maintained custody until the final days, with prisoners liberated by advancing communist forces or fleeing in the general collapse. Testimonies from both former prisoners and guards describe confusion, fear, and sporadic violence in those final weeks. The legal framework that determined prisoner classification, POW, criminal, security offender, political prisoner, existed until April 30th, 1975, when Saigon fell and the Republic of Vietnam ceased to exist. The victorious Democratic Republic of Vietnam promptly established its own categories. Re-education for former military and government personnel. Counter-revolutionary, for those deemed threats to the new order. The pattern of using legal labels to justify detention and coerced behavior continued, now under different authority. The continuity was notable. Both systems relied on early classification to determine treatment and duration of custody. Both systems used coercive interrogation to extract information and confessions. Both systems maintained parallel tracks. Some prisoners in relatively transparent facilities, others in less visible detention where conditions were harsher and oversight minimal. The political justifications differed. The structural mechanisms showed persistent similarities. For individuals who passed through South Vietnam's detention system between 1954 and 1975, the first hour after capture often determined everything. Whether they entered formal POW custody with Geneva Convention protections, became criminal defendants in a legal process, disappeared into security detention, or never survived to be registered at all. The legal frameworks existed. The paper trail was extensive, but the critical moment remained the least regulated and most consequential. Decades after the war's end, archives in Saigon, Washington, Hanoi, Geneva, and London hold extensive documentation of prisoner systems in South Vietnam. MACV directives and legal assessments describe the official framework. ICRC reports detail conditions in recognized POW camps. Congressional hearings preserve testimony about Phoenix and police practices. NGO reports document torture and political imprisonment. Statistical summaries track prisoner counts across multiple categories. The documentary record supports several conclusions. First, the legal and doctrinal framework governing prisoner treatment was comprehensive and, on paper, largely consistent with international law. Geneva Convention standards were codified in MACV directives. Military legal officers drafted detailed guidance. POW camps were designed to meet inspection standards. The rules existed. Second, implementation varied dramatically by location and circumstance. In recognized POW camps subject to ICRC inspection and MACV oversight, conditions generally met basic standards, particularly by the early 1970s. In the district compounds, police stations, provincial interrogation centers, and the immediate aftermath of capture operations, practice diverged sharply from policy. Coercion, torture, and occasional killing were documented by multiple independent sources. Third, the statistical landscape was fragmented and contested. Official figures of 37,451 communist POWs represented those processed through military custody. Estimates of political and security detainees ranged far higher, 100,000 to 200,000 according to external observers, reflecting parallel detention systems under different legal authorities. Individuals killed or disappeared before formal registration appeared in no statistics at all. Fourth, the first hour after capture was structurally the weakest point. This was where fear, intelligence pressure, and local emotions converged. This was where formal procedures were most often ignored or abbreviated. This was where classification decisions were made that determined an individual's entire trajectory through the system. From a military effectiveness standpoint, treatment of prisoners affected enemy willingness to surrender. Colonel Prue's legal analysis emphasized this tactical reality. Adversaries who expected humane treatment were more likely to surrender, providing both intelligence and reducing friendly casualties in battle. Harsh treatment in the first hour undermined this dynamic. From a legitimacy standpoint, prisoner treatment tested a state's commitment to its own laws and values. South Vietnam maintained extensive legal frameworks, participated in international conventions, and allowed ICRC access to POW camps. These efforts coexisted with documented systematic abuse in less visible parts of the detention system, particularly in the immediate aftermath of capture. The contrast between official policy and field practice became a recurring theme in international criticism and domestic debate. The Vietnam War's prisoner question left behind not only casualty lists and destruction, but a detailed archive showing how the moment after capture became a test of laws, institutions, and legitimacy.